It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better... Sheriff? Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, Commander of the Armies of the North, General of the Felix Legions, and you are listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. I've been talking with Chris off and on over the last couple weeks, and he's agreed to come on the show. And it's a fascinating account. All of this happened in Kentucky, and it all started on his grandmother's property. The whole family would go out to their grandmother's property, and they would have run-ins with this creature. And towards the end, there's kind of a twist to the encounter, and I'll let Chris kind of go into it. But it's a very strange portion of the encounter. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance to check out sasquatchchronicles.com, you can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Chris to the show. Chris, thanks for coming on.
Hey, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being here and sharing kind of your family's encounters, your encounter, and I'm fascinated to know how all of this started. I know we're going to Kentucky, it's the mid-'70s, and it's on your grandmother's property. If you would, how did all of this start?
Growing up with a large family that I had, we would all gather around Grandma's dinner table and sat there through the night, and she would tell us these stories of the farm. And starting in mid-late 70s, they started seeing something out there at the farm, and it was down a gravel road, kind of like carved out of woods, and it was an old orchard. So this was an old farmhouse on an orchard. It had a pond, and then her property ended into just fields and fields of cattle. So my mom pulled up one night before she could even turn her car off in the driveway. My uncle was outside opening her door, telling her to come inside. She didn't know what was going on or what this was all about, but he was just very adamant about get inside now, get inside now. And she said, "What's going on? Are you drinking? Have you been smoking something?" And he said, "No, you need to get in the house now. This is serious." And she said, "What is going on? What's so serious?" And he said, "There's something out here." And she said, "Yeah, there's a lot of things out here. We're in the country." He said, "No, there's something out here, and it's about 7 feet tall, and it's hairy." And she said that she started laughing, and he then rushed her in the house where every light in the house was on. My grandmother, my mom, my aunt, and 2 of my uncles were all there. And she said she was kind of mind blown. It was hard to process it all. And they told her that there was something in the woods that was about 7 or 8 feet tall and hairy. And she said still she didn't know how to react because she couldn't take it serious, but they were being very serious. And they said, here, we'll show you. And they said that the yard ended into pretty dense forest. And my uncle stepped out the front door and with the spotlight started following the tree line. And then whatever this was, stepped out of the spotlight beam. And this was something that happened. They said anytime you wanted to see it at nighttime, you could. They said that whenever it would come around, you would hear no other animals, no crickets or bugs or birds or any other noise, and that you could smell it whenever it was close. Said that it just smelled horrible. Everyone in the family saw it. What they've described is something that's between 7 and 8 feet tall and has a bare chest, bare fingers, bare face, and is just covered in either dark brown or black hair. Said that it's kind of matted, kind of long hair, but you could definitely see it anytime that you wanted to.
Yeah, it sounds like it was like right there next to the house. I wonder why it was hanging out there.
Well, the fruit orchard was so close, they believed that it was eating out of the fruit orchard, and it had a water source there, which was a pond. So that pond was on the edge of the woods. Half the pond was in the woods, half was in the yard. But you got to think this is a 3-acre yard that this house was on that was cleared. So they said that pretty much anytime you wanted to see it at night, they said you could go outside. If you didn't hear any bugs, you could just sit outside for a while and you could smell it before you seen it. And they said they could smell it from 100 yards away. Now, I have an uncle that is an avid hunter, and they called him, and he thought it was a joke at first. So he came out, brought 2 dogs, and he said as soon as a dog would pick up a scent trail, they would stop in their tracks and cower. And these dogs were hunting dogs. That's what they did. That's all they knew. That was their purpose. So he said that was kind of concerning to him. But they ended up walking through the woods one night. They said it was just after dark. The dogs just stopped and left. And that's when he saw it for the first time.
Yeah, and I know we'll come back to your uncle, but at this point in time, what did he explain to you what he saw?
Everybody described the same thing. They said they said it looked like a man, but it was between 7 and 8 feet tall and covered in hair. Said it was just dark hair. And it's not like you could just walk up and see one. They said that you could see one either walking away or behind some branches on a tree or behind a tree trunk. It just didn't make a huge effort to get away from them.
Yeah, and all of this is going on in what, the mid-70s, Chris?
This is probably 76 or 77. And the sightings, they weren't shy about it. They told people. And of course, you get the stereotypical, everybody thinks you're crazy. And they actually had friends that came out that didn't believe them. And some people, they said, would smell it and leave. And some people would stick around, and they had a spotlight, and they said that you couldn't see it every night if there was a lot of people there, but some nights you still could. They said that they had a antenna for TV that they would climb on top of the single-story house, and you could set up there with the spotlight, and every night you could see some movement with the spotlight. And when I say see it every night, I don't mean like it walks out and waves. It's just you could see it stepping out of the light or retreating into the forest. But you could definitely see it.
How many years did this go on out there?
It started in 76, 77, and then it actually got popular enough because I live in a smaller town. We're 50,000 people, but it's kind of still everybody knows everybody. It got popular enough that our local newspaper did a story on it. And they said after the newspaper did the story, and this was in 1978 is when the newspaper did the story, said that the popularity got crazy, that they mentioned the road that they lived on and people were trying to find their house. And they said it wasn't bad publicity. Like a lot of people came and would share their stories of sightings or encounters that they had, and would recognize that they believed and they had saw something too. Because you have to think Kentucky in the 1970s was pretty royal compared to what it is now.
Yeah, without a doubt. So around town, you guys are becoming known. You know, people know where you live. They know what's going on, what you're seeing. What a tough position to put your grandparents in. And then on top of that, they're dealing with this thing.
They said that it was one of those things where they said after a few days they stopped being scared, because instantly they said it was kind of like just an uneasy fear. They didn't know what this was. They knew that it was very big and that it wasn't afraid of them, but it didn't show any aggression. So they said after a few days, like, that petrified fear kind of went away, and a lot of curiosity set in on what it is. Why is it here? So this kind of continued. They said that after the initial excitement and craziness died down, that it never left. They said that it just kind of became part of the life. Is if you go outside at night, if you smelled something, you could get a spotlight or a flashlight and see something. It never bothered them. It was never at the house, but you could see where it's been in the orchard and twisted off limbs of apple trees and pear trees.
Yeah, it still amazes me to this day. You'll be talking to someone on the phone, and like the two brothers is a good example. And I would hear these things off in the background. They'd be walking around on their property, and you could hear these things going off in the background. And I would ask the brothers, what was that? And they would go, oh, well, it was one of those things. I think over time, you kind of become numb to it.
Yeah, they said that there was a lot of vocalization out there. They said that it wasn't always screams that you heard, but there was definitely screams. And they said that the screams would make your hair stand on end, and it was incredibly loud. What I've recognized from listening to your podcast is what everyone calls chatter now, where it almost sounds like a ununderstandable language. Like you can tell it's trying to be communication, but it's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's just chatter. And my grandmother raised a garden as well. And it would take, she said, tomatoes, watermelons, and whatever it wanted from the garden. She said it was kind of one of those things where if it didn't bother you, you didn't bother it. It was like a coexistence pretty much. But going back to the don't bother it, it don't bother you. My uncle, who was the hunter, actually shot one with a 45 carbine, and it was one of the first times that he had been there. And he's the kind of person that if it's there, he wants to know what it is and why it's there. And they said they were walking around the backside of the pond where it started going into some thick brush and wooded area. And it was shortly after dark, and they had a flashlight on, but they didn't have the spotlight on. And one stood up very close to him. They don't know if this one saw them coming or didn't see him coming, but he said that it was close enough that he guarantees that he hit it, and it was underneath its arms, because when it stood up, it had its arms raised. He said it made a terrible noise and went tearing through the woods. And with him being a hunter, he said he was going to track it. Well, he said that there was no blood, that where he hit it on the ground was like a ball of fat. He said there was some blood in it, but it wasn't an active blood trail. He said it was kind of like a fatty material that was a little bit bloody. And then there was no trail to track. You could follow footprints and broken trees and grass, but there was no blood trail.
Yeah, that's very strange, very bizarre. What do you make of that?
I have no idea. And if this is an animal that doesn't know when it's going to eat again, I imagine they eat a lot and maybe just have a layer of fat stored like a bear before hibernation.
Yeah, so I'm assuming your uncle never actually caught up with the creature?
No, he doesn't think it died. He said that something that large, one round from a 45, he doesn't think would drop it. Now he guessed 10 yards away from it, which is ridiculously close. And he said he doesn't know why. And that was one of his biggest things, is he didn't know why it stayed there and let them get so close. But he said it stood up and kind of had its arms up. And when it put its arms up, he just pointed and pulled the trigger.
Yeah, a little reckless. I like his style, though. Was there any sort of aggression towards you guys after this? I mean, did it ever come up towards the house or anything like that?
No, there was never any sign of aggression. Now, my mother had a Saint Bernard, and it had puppies, and there was an attached garage to my grandmother's house. And you got to think this house was built so long ago that it had the old school garage door that just broke into like 3 pieces and opened, and it had oval windows. And she said that she was out there one night bottle feeding her puppies, and they were all crying and making noise. And she said that she noticed that the light on one of the 2 windows got blocked out. And she said she looked out and she could see one out the window that was close enough she could see its bare chest. She said that's the one thing she remembered. She said, this was her exact words, "It was so close to the window, I could see his titty nipples." She said that she put the puppies in a box, took them inside and shut the door. And that was that. Like I said, there was never any sign of aggression at all. But with this going on for years, it was just one of those things that they kind of lived with. They said that people would call them crazy, that it was kind of one of those, either people loved it and wanted to hear about it, wanted to come see it, or thought they were just absolutely nuts. But they said they always knew when they were around because there was no other noise, which I always thought was very interesting. There's no other noise, no crickets or bugs or anything making noise, and then you could smell whenever they were close.
Yeah, even though I said earlier you kind of get used to it. I wouldn't say get used to it. I would say it almost becomes like the norm. But it never really does, because your grandmother actually moved away from this farm, didn't she?
Yes, that was the reason why she moved. So there was an old magazine. It was called the UFO Report. And the 1979 issue featured my family. The gentleman that wrote for the local newspaper was a freelance writer for this magazine, and he submitted a story to them, and they picked up the story. And then after they picked up the story, of course, he came out and got permission. My family gave him permission. He snapped a few photos, and the 1979 issue of UFO Report was my family talking about, I believe they called it the Fairview Horror is what they called it. And the magazine described this as a monster, and it had accounts for other sightings in the area, and actually one that was probably 30 minutes away, and said that it frequented a farmhouse that was in cornfields, and it became the Spottsville Monster. And they said for some reason, the one that the people were seeing in Spottsville was saw by multiple people, but they said it looked green. And they said they didn't know if that was from the corn that it stayed in, because it would always come out of a cornfield.
Yeah, you're right there where the Spottsville Monster was in the time frame. You know, I think the Spottsville Monster was right around 1975, 76. And I interviewed the Nunley family that encountered that creature, and I'm convinced that Spottsville Monster was probably something more like a dogman. I remember interviewing Mrs. Nunley, the mother, and she would tell me they would sit up on the roof and they would shoot at this thing. And she goes like, "I know we hit it several times, but it never went down." And a lot of confusion. But I really think that Spottsville Monster was probably some sort of canine. So the magazine comes out, they print, your poor grandmother, she probably doesn't want all this attention. So what happens when the magazine comes out? Do more people show up?
So the magazine comes out, and it was 1980. My grandmother said that two gentlemen knocked on the door. And every story that I'm telling you is straight from my grandmother's mouth. My grandmother was a golden person. They don't make people like her anymore. She never lied, because she said she hated a liar and she hated a thief, and you could lock your stuff from a thief, but you couldn't hide from a liar. That was her biggest thing. Everything that my grandma told you was nothing but the truth. So she said in 1980, she had two gentlemen knock on the door, and she said first glance she thought they were Jehovah Witnesses. She said that she thought that they wanted to talk to her about their church and that they were Mormon. She said they were wearing black slacks with black shoes, had a white button-down shirt and a black tie. And they asked if they were the family that had the Bigfoot. And she said, that depends on who's asking. And they introduced themselves as field agents from the Smithsonian Institute. And they said that they had gotten information from the magazine that there was a lot of activity on her property. And she said, yes, that's us. Come in. So they walked in and they started talking to my grandmother. And she said that they were just really interested in what it was and how long it had been there and what kind of evidence they had and if they had any photos or if they had any audio. And she said she told them that they didn't. Said that we've tried to take photos, but it's too dark outside. And of course, in 1980, photography wasn't the best. So she said that she gave these two guys a tour around her farm, and she took them to the garden and showed them where it had gone through her plants and took her tomatoes and took her watermelons. And she walked them through the orchard. And she said before she could say anything to them, they said, oh, look, this is where it broke a branch off. And she said that there was a stripped branch on the ground. And she said, yeah, it breaks off every branch it could reach. So if there's fruit on a low-hanging branch, it doesn't take the fruit, it breaks the branch. And she said these guys were just kind of like giddy schoolgirls. Like they said that they were just really excited and happy to be there. And that they started making impressions of footprints. She said that she could show you footprints anytime you wanted to see them. So they started making impressions of footprints, and they were in the orchard. And one of them said, look, this is the limb that it ripped off. And there was a stripped limb on the ground that had been twisted off. Said it wasn't a clean break. It was a twist because it was a green limb that was healthy and it didn't want to come off. So it twisted this limb and pulled it off. And she said this guy got on his hands and knees and started filling the ground and was like, this is where it set its big fat ass down and ate those apples. And said that they had noticed, but he found indentions where he said was a butt print. And then you could see two grooves in the ground where it would be heel prints. And she said that they took everything that they would let them have, said that they went to the surrounding property on the barbed wire fences and took hair out of the barbed wire fences. Said they cast a lot of footprints and they cast that area where they said one had set down. And they said that them personally at that time was the most evidence they had ever seen. And they ended up staying for 2 days. And they set up audio equipment and said they were able to get some audio, but they didn't get like a really good screen.
Strange, right? I mean, this seems like way out of scope for the Smithsonian. You know what I mean?
It's very strange. And it's always just intrigued me that a small, a family in Kentucky, like small town USA, can have something go on and it reached that level. But it was after that nationally publicized magazine, whenever this happened. And she said that they would take fruit where you could see that it would take like a bite out of fruit and then not finish the whole thing and put it on the ground. Said that they had coolers and plastic bags that they wrapped everything in and took the cast of the butt print and the heel prints and the footprints and set up audio and video and were able to catch audio recordings, but no video. And said that they would take them onto the house and show them, with the spotlight. And they would ask questions like, how many of them are there? And my uncle's very much a smart aleck. He would say, there's 4 or 5 of them, or one that's just really fast. And they would say, what do you mean by that? And he described it as they were on the backside of the pond, and he could hit one with the spotlight and scan and find another and scan and find another. And he said the most that they had ever seen would be 3. And they asked for description. And again, between 6 and 7 feet tall, hairy. And they said, are you seeing men? Are you seeing males or females? And my uncle's like, well, how do you tell the difference? And they ask him, what is the first thing you notice about a woman? And him being him, he said, "Oh, her tits." And they said, "Exactly. Do these have tits or do they have a smooth chest?" And he said, "Oh, no, very muscular chest." He said, "Okay, well, you're seeing males." And of course, my family had a ton of questions for them as well. And they said one night that they were there and they hit one with a spotlight on the roof of the house, and they got down, and the guys from Smithsonian played an audio that they had of one screaming, and said that you could hear chatter as a response, but you couldn't hear, there was no screaming and nothing was very clear. Said it sounded like it was off from a distance. And my grandmother rushed them in the house and shut and locked the door. And they said, why did you lock the door?" And she said, "Well, I don't want them coming in here." And they said, "Do you think that if it wanted to come in your home, it would use your door and you could stop it?" And my grandma said that's when it kind of hit her that as large as this thing was, you could do nothing to protect yourself from it. And they asked, "Why is it here?" And they said, "Well, we're in Kentucky. What is Kentucky known for?" Coal mining. And said that we believe that they've probably live in a coal mine or at least stay there a lot of the time. And they found your farm because you have a water source, you have fruit and vegetables, and then you're surrounded by cattle. So really, why wouldn't it be here for a long period of time? It had everything it needed. Your winters aren't super harsh, and they like it.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, did these guys actually work for the Smithsonian? I mean, what did they work for the Smithsonian and it was just kind of an interest? They read it in the magazine and in the paper, thought they'd come check it out. Was it something official from the Smithsonian to come check this out? Or was it complete BS? Because in 1980, when you tell an old lady that you're from the Smithsonian, she's probably going to tell you what you want to hear.
Yes, because there's no Google, there's no credentials. My grandmother said she saw nothing more than a name tag. Because that's what I asked her. I said, "Grandma, were these people really from the Smithsonian?" And she said, "That's what they said the entire time they were there." And they said these guys were so excited that they had gotten this evidence that they had gotten. She said that they told her that they believed that they have a family system where the males will go out and gather food and take it home. And that they also believed that they lived in colonies. And my grandmother said that when they said colonies, all she could imagine was a hill of ants, like an ant colony. And she ultimately, that was the reason why she moved. After those guys came in 1980 and left, she moved in 1982. And she said that the sightings never stopped. And she kept the property for some years, but then ended up selling it to some family friends. And now that property it's still down the gravel lane, but there's been so much more development past that property that the property went into what's really close to a subdivision now. There's still a few cattle fields, but nowhere near the size that they used to be.
Yeah, I'm still blown away by the whole Smithsonian thing, man. It makes you, I mean, obviously they weren't from there.
Oh, I just wonder how credible that was. Like I said, in 1980, you're not thinking of checking credentials. You're just taking a word for it. But she said that they stayed for 2 days and they tried everything they could. Said that they had, I said, "Well, what do they drive, Grandma?" She said they drove a black 4-door Ford car. I said, "Okay." And she said that they had tons of audio equipment with them and video equipment and had cameras, and that they said they had the trunk was full of coolers, and the coolers had the casting for the footprints in it, and that's what they pulled out to make the footprints was material that was in the cooler. And then they put she said that there was like a tomato, watermelon, few tomatoes, and they took them with them because they had bite marks taken out of them. She said she didn't know if they didn't like them, if they were too ripe, if they were not ripe enough. But she said that there would be times where she would have 4 or 5 tomato plants missing out of the beginning of a row that she knew it had fruit on them. The branches were constantly out of the orchard. But again, she said she just kind of learned to live with it. They didn't hurt her. She didn't bother them. And at the time, it was my grandmother, 2 of my uncles, and my mom and my aunt that lived there. So the house was constantly an active house.
And it's a really cool opportunity that you had, Chris. I mean, you have your grandmother, your mom, your uncle, a lot of family that have experienced it. And as you sat around and had those conversations with them, did anyone ever say what they thought Sasquatch was?
Our family was very close to each other. So we would all gather around the dinner table at night. And it wasn't uncommon for me to have 2 uncles, an aunt, my mom, my grandmother, and cousins all over at my grandma's house. It was like the hub of the family. So there was many of nights that we sat with an uncle or 2, myself and my mom, and they were telling these Bigfoot stories to my cousins and myself. They said that they feel like it is some kind of primate, but a whole lot more than that. They said that they know it's an animal, but they feel like it's a highly intelligent animal that's just undiscovered.
Yeah, and that's definitely a fair answer. I know that your mother bought a home not far from your grandmother back in 2000. Tell me about that.
So growing up, hearing all the Sasquatch stories, it was always, you were always kind of had it in the back of your mind whenever you were in the woods or when you were out alone. So my mother was in the process of buying some property that didn't work out from a friend of hers. And it was about 30 minutes outside of Owensboro. And then you turned onto a gravel road, and the gravel road turned right. And then when it went up a steep hill, and there's a gradual left that ended you behind the house. And this house was on a horse farm. And there was 18 acres. There was a strip pit, and then there was 2 ponds. And most of the acreage was smooth because of the horses. There was a very large field, and it had been cleared, and there was actually a horse track in that field from where the lady that she was buying the property from raised horses. There was a 8-horse stable, the horse track, and that was right next to a pond. But at the end of this 18 acres, it just was immediately dense forest. And the forest kind of had like a leg that ran all the way up beside the house, but it wasn't very wide. So you could probably walk 20, 30 feet and be through the small patch of woods out on the other side into a field again. But that leg ran into just dense woods for miles. And we had a friend of mine live with us. He didn't have a good home life, and he ended up coming to stay with us and was there for about 6 months. And on this property, at about dawn, it was about daylight, there would be something that would scream, and it would be loud enough that it would wake you up in the house. And whenever this would happen, you wake up startled, and then you would walk out of the bedroom into the living room, and my mom would be sitting on the couch, and she would say, yeah, it woke me up too. And I would always ask her what it was, and she would tell me it was a bobcat. And looking back at it, I imagine it's because I was, 14 and 15 years old. She didn't want to scare me. But we lived far enough out. We had no sort of trash pickup at all. And we had a trash burn pit that was probably about 25, 30 feet from the woods at the end of our property because we didn't want to burn trash that close to our house. And it was my job to take the trash bags out. And I would tell my mom, I'm like, there's something in the woods. Like, I can hear it. I can hear it walk. And she would say, oh, it's a deer. And I'm like, no, it's not a deer. I said, I know what a deer sounds like. A deer runs away from you. This doesn't run away from you. You can hear it move, but it doesn't get further away. And it got to the point where I would just walk out and get close to the trash pile and throw the bag and then run back in. If it was any time close to dark, this would happen. And I would tell my mom and my dad, and my dad would kind of just write it off like, oh, you're just being scared. You're scared of the dark. You need to take a flashlight with you, which I would have a flashlight. But my mom would say, oh, it's just a deer, or, it was a bobcat. It was this, it was that. Well, one night we always turned on our porch light before we left, because whenever it was dark out there, it was absolutely dark. You could see nothing. There was no other houses. There was no other lights. There was nothing. One night we pulled up to no porch light, and Myself, my mom, and my friend that was staying with us, we got out of the truck. And when we got out of the truck, we had 2 St. Bernards and this half Yorkie, half Chihuahua. That was my dog. Her name was Buttons. There was a noise. And the best way to describe it would be if there's a little girl that's on the verge of crying, but not there yet, like just kind of like a whimper. I don't know. It was very strange. Like it's nothing like I've ever heard. I said to my mom, I said, "What is that?" And she goes, "That's Buttons. You need to just go ahead and go in the house." And I said, "That's not Buttons. Buttons is at my feet." And I said, I have her and she's shaking. And the St. Bernard, you couldn't see her because it was so dark, but you could hear her, and she was moving. She was actively moving, but not in a certain direction. It was like she was just anxious or confused about something. And this noise got louder and louder, and you could hear different tones in it, but it was just the strangest noise. It sounded like an upset little girl. And you could hear the noise start to move. And it's cold outside. It's snowy. There's no leaves in the trees. So you hear whatever is making this noise, you hear it taking steps. And you can tell there's more, or there's no more than 2 feet there. Like, you know what it sounds like when something is walking upright. So my mom rushes me in the house. She's get in the house. And I'm like, I'm at that stage where I'm terrified, but I want to know what it is. And I don't know if it was the fear that made me stand still, but I just stood there holding my dog, and you could hear this noise move around the house, and it got louder and louder and louder. And then you heard it start getting quieter and go through the woods. So my mom said, "Get in the house now. Get in the house now." Oh, I've got goosebumps just telling you about it. And of course, you're terrified. You don't know what this is. You can tell it's something moving on 2 legs. You can tell that it's big, but you don't know what it is. And I was like, "What in the hell was that? What is that noise?" She said, "I don't know, but I've got to go get Princeton." My mom had a male and a female St. Bernard, and the female was in heat, and she didn't want her to get bred. So we had a chain that we put the male dog on at a horse barn that was on the edge of these woods. And the horse barn was around there's a 5-foot fence around it. It was just thin wire, flexible, just enough to keep a horse where you wanted it to be. I said, "Well, you can go out there. I'm not going back outside." I said, "I don't know what that was." I said, "The dogs doesn't like it. I'm not going out there." And my friend, being a 15-year-old boy, said, "Don't worry, I'll go with you." Like, it was a lot of security. And they walked out to this horse barn that was 50 yards away from the house, and it backed up to some pretty thick woods. And my mom said that when she went there, that this St. Bernard, he was over 200 pounds. He was a very large dog. She said that he had pulled the chain as tight as he could away from it and had his rear end facing the house, like he was trying to pull his head out of a collar. She said she reached down and the chain was pulled too tight to unclip the chain. So she just unbuckled his collar. And she said whenever they turned to move, she described it as it sounded like somebody let the air out of a tractor and trailer tire. She said there was just a loud hiss and that horse barn shook. They ran back into the house, and that was that. She wouldn't tell me what it was, couldn't tell me what it was, whatever the circumstances were. It was probably 10 minutes later. I said, was that a Sasquatch? Was that what you heard growing up? Like, is that it? And she said, "No, I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that." And I said, "And is that what it was?" She said, I don't know. She said, "Well, go look in the morning." So morning came, pretty much sleepless night. I was waiting to hear something again. I was still very anxious and quite a bit afraid. The next morning we walked out and we went to that horse barn. And on the way to the horse barn, we found tracks in the snow. They were like a human barefoot, but very large. For me, it was a lot of excitement because I get to see tracks, and that's the first time I've ever saw tracks. I heard these stories my entire life. And now I get to see the tracks. And I was super excited, but at the same time, pretty scared. And we followed the tracks from the driveway of the house around about 10 feet on the end of the house. And they went around a garden spot my mom had, and then over the fence into that horse pen. And that's where we stopped following them. But my mom called my uncle and she said, listen, you're not going to believe this. And she told him the story. Well, she had to go to work. So we drove the 30 minutes into Owensboro. And then it was kind of like a trade-off. I got in the car with my uncle and two of my cousins, and we drove right back out to the house. And we followed the tracks in and out of the horse pen, which was a 5-foot fence. So whatever this was, had no problem getting over this fence without disturbing the fence, because the fence was not structurally sound. We followed them into one of the fields across where the horse racetrack was, where it was a nice, smooth field. And then it went from snow to mud, and then the tracks disappeared. We ended up following the tracks for I would probably say a half mile, probably across 12 of those 18 acres. At the time, my cousin wore a size 14 shoe. He had a pair of Reebok Allen Iversons on, so they were a basketball shoe. And he wore a 14, and we used to have, I don't know if my mother still has them or not, but we took photos, like real photos. I know that's crazy nowadays, but they were real, go get them developed with your film photos of these tracks. And there were some that were like almost perfect. I mean, you could see toes, you could see heels, and the tracks seemed to be anywhere from like probably 4 or 5 feet apart to 7 or 8 feet apart. Like there were big gaps in these tracks. We took photos of them with the size 14 inside of them and beside them. And with a 14 shoe, they were probably 4 to 5 inches longer than a 14 shoe. And again, this is coming from a memory when I was 15 years old. They may have been huge, and I remember them being bigger because I was scared, excited in the moment, but they were much larger than a size 14 men's basketball shoe.
Yeah, that's a big print, man. And it is kind of cool to find trace evidence, especially with your background and your family and all this stuff going on. To be able to find tracks is very, very cool. Does your mom still live on the property?
No, we ended up leaving the property about a year and a half after that. You could always hear a scream. And when I say always, I don't mean like it was on cue. I mean, if you waited long enough for it, you could hear a scream of vocalization. It would happen at least once a month. And it was always at daylight. And she always blamed it on bobcats, because there were bobcats on property. You could watch them with the binoculars, drink from one of the ponds that you could see from the house. So for me, being a kid, I bought that it was a bobcat. But you got to think in 99, 2000, the internet wasn't what it is today. So I didn't Google search a bobcat scream to make sure that's what it was. That was my mom. That's what she told me. That's what I believed until all of that happened. And then I kind of knew better that it wasn't a bobcat.
Yeah, and I get where your mom's coming from. I mean, no sense in freaking out your kids and go with the bobcat thing. I get where she's coming from. And I really do appreciate sharing, your family and the history of your family on this property. What do you think that they are, Chris? What do you think Sasquatch is?
I have a lot of feelings about it. Okay. It like we spoke about, it's really hard to swallow that there's no bodies, that there's no more evidence than there is. I mean, there's a ton of evidence, but there's no irrefutable photos or videos. There's no bodies, there's no specimen. I believe it is a very intelligent animal. I don't believe that it is like a supernatural being that can teleport and have portals. I believe that it is flesh and blood. I believe it's something that has been smart enough to avoid us. And who knows how many of the photos and videos that you see are real. There's so many people out there with so many photos and videos. And my mind goes to kind of like religion and aliens. I'm not a very religious person. I believe there's something, I don't know what it is. But there's people that you can talk to that will make you believe, that have such crazy stories, that have so many feelings about it that you can't help but to believe. But then there's also that nut job that'll tell you that he's, the 14th coming of Christ and that the end is near, and it kind of blows all of those solid feelings away. And the same thing with aliens. There's so many sightings of UFOs and so many reports of it. And then you'll have the person that got abducted and probed and just kind of blows all credibility for the whole subject apart. And that's kind of how I feel about Sasquatch. Like, until I found your podcast, I was on Reddit a lot. I'm on a few different Sasquatch pages there. I always look at every TV show that comes on, but they end up kind of all being the same thing. But I do believe there's something there. What it is, I don't know. I do believe it's flesh and blood. I do believe a lot of sightings that people have are very real. Whenever I listen to your show, you can hear someone's feelings, if that makes any kind of sense at all. You can tell when someone's going through something that they've actually gone through. And without a doubt in my mind, there's something there. There's something that somebody sees. There's something that is leaving these footprints and letting out these yells and making these chatters. But what it is exactly, I don't know. And I think that's probably one of the things that keep drawing me to this subject is I want to know.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, Chris. I think, the Bigfoot world, the Bigfoot community it's cancer, man. It's cancer to be around, and most of the people are cancer to be around. And, when someone does come along and go, hey, I'm the chosen one, I'm I'm with you. That stuff really irritates me when, I'll send you a lot of chosen ones in the Bigfoot world. Does your grandmother, that the property that she sold off, has that area grown up?
No, that area. So the family friends that bought that area is still family friends, and they kind of use it as a getaway. Their son is an avid hunter. They use it as like a hunting property, pretty much. They just kind of have it to have it. My grandmother sold it incredibly cheap for what it was, and they jumped on it and haven't got away from it yet.
Makes you wonder if stuff is still going on there today.
I wonder the same thing, because it's an area that I pass semi often, and I look down that gravel road and I want to go back there so bad. I need to get in touch with the family and just ask them, like, can I just go hang out there one night? It looks like something out of like a movie, or the lane does. It's a gravel road, and there's just like a single line of trees on each side of the road. And the trees are tall enough now. I don't know if they used to be back in the 70s and 80s, but they're tall enough now. They make like a canopy over the road. And every time I drive by there, I slow down and look down the road, and I'm like, I want to go out there. I've heard you ask in your show, like, has this changed your life? And it's kind of a unique case for me, because it didn't happen to me before it changed my life. Growing up, whenever you get out of the house and, you go around the neighborhood, you meet your friends' parents, you have your parents drop you off at school friend's house. It was always, oh, hi, it's nice to meet you. What is your parents' name? And you would tell them, and they would say, well, what is your mom's maiden name? And I would probably say about half of the time, it would automatically come back to, is your family the people that said they saw the Bigfoot? Your family's crazy. And it was always either your family's crazy or, yeah, that was really cool. I remember when that was happening. It was never kind of like anything in between. It was always crazy or cool. It was different growing up that way. It was to the point where you didn't want them to know your family at some points in time. But it was a wild experience growing up with kind of that hanging over your head.
Yeah, I bet it was tough. I bet it was very, very tough. And, like your family made it into the UFO magazine and, into the paper. And today that doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But back in 1980, that was a pretty big deal. And, when people come forward, they share their own personal encounter. It's very, very personal, when it's your own encounter. But here you're talking about, you're sharing with us, your family's encounter, the history on this land, your grandmother, God rest her soul. And I really appreciate your time and the fact that you would come on and share what happened to you. Thank you so much, Chris.
Hey, no problem, man. Have a good night. Enjoy your dinner.
I will, man. I'm starving. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone.